Okay, we're live, everyone. Welcome to the stream. Very pleased today to be joined by Connor and by Patricia. Patricia's been a regular guest on this channel, so most of you should know her. Connor, I think this is your first ever live stream, did you say, Connor, beforehand?
Yeah, I don't think I've done any live streams before, so I think it's my first time. So yeah, thanks for popping my cherry.
Fantastic. Oh, well, absolute honor, mate. What we're going to be discussing today, then, folks, is the age-old question that philosophers have been racking their brains out throughout all time, and us three are going to solve this question today. No, we're basically going to try our best to get to the bottom of what we think the answer to this is. We all actually are coming from different perspectives on this. So this is going to be interesting, but it's not a debate. We're not here to have like a winner, a loser, or to catch people in a contradiction or anything like that. We're trying to actually find out ultimately the right answer to this question, because it's very important, right? Are there moral facts? Is something factually, immoral or moral? So, for example, things like murder and theft, is it just a given fact and not down to opinion that these things are bad? That would be objective morality or moral realism, someone could call it, although someone might distinguish between those two things, I'm not sure. Or is things like murder, theft, are these just subjectively bad? That is, we can all likely here agree that they're bad, but this is nothing more than just our own opinions. We'll get into what we mean maybe in more detail by objective and subjective and stuff as we go, and kind of refine those points. And Pat also wanted to say before we start that this is a branch of philosophy known as meta-ethics. Pat, did you just want to just explain why that is and the difference between the other things?
Yeah, no, I just thought it would be important to identify what area of moral philosophy we're talking about. So in moral philosophy and ethics, there's three different categories. Generally speaking, there's applied ethics. So that is when you kind of take broader philosophical principles and apply it to a real world issue like euthanasia or even animal rights, corporate responsibility, that kind of thing, to give three examples. And then there's normative ethics, which is questions of how we ought to live. What should we do in this situation? And that's when discussions of frameworks like deontology, utilitarianism, consequentialism usually come up. So the questions of how should we live our life? And these are some of the popular frameworks or well-known frameworks to guide us. So we're in meta-ethics right now, and meta-ethics is concerned with what do we actually mean by good and bad? Are these preferences of people, or is there some objective standard that we are appealing to? And that's kind of the area we're in. So what do we actually mean by those terms?
Cool. Yeah. Now, I think the way that most people, definitely most subjectivists, would describe moral realism or objective morality, they're basically saying it's mind independent. So I think the way you'd previously described it to me, Pat, is it's not just a matter of some kind of opinion. It'd be something like gravity. It's just this concrete physical fact about the world that it's not just sort of is not based on a mind. So it's not like red is a nice color or something like that. That would be a subjective opinion. Moral objectivists, maybe there's some kind of contention with that point there, but I'm not sure. They might see it perhaps as it not necessarily having that definition that it's mind independent. Maybe we could go into that. But just to give everyone listening a rough idea of our positions at the moment, Connor is a moral objectivist. Pat is not a moral objectivist. She believes that morals are subjective. I'm maybe a little bit somewhere in between at the moment. I'm leaning more towards objective, but I've had numerous discussions with Pat about this, and she could well be right that it's just down to opinion. I think the most interesting way here to get the ball rolling is Connor, I would like you to explain why you think morality, so for example, what's happening to farmed animals is just objectively wrong. It's not just a matter of opinion. And then maybe we can just kind of go from there and just get having some back and forth. So, Connor, did you want to just say why you think things such as what's happening to animals or murder and theft and things like this Why is this just factually bad?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just start by like talking about my general approach to philosophy and how I go about justifying beliefs across all domains. I like a view that's called phenomenal conservatism. Are you guys familiar with it?
No.
Can I explain it? So basically, phenomenal conservatism just says if it seems to you that something is the case and you don't have a good reason to doubt that seeming, then you're justified in believing that things are as they appear. And the reason I think that is because, like, I don't like what are the alternatives to think that things aren't as they appear, or to not have any beliefs. Like, at some point when you look at all your beliefs, you're going to say, okay, how do I know that? How do I know that? And you're going to go all the way down to bedrock. And at some point, you're going to have to appeal to some premise where you're just like, it just seems to me that it's obvious that 1 + 1 = 2, and that the external world is real and things like this. Because if you don't have a foundational epistemic theory, then you're just committed to saying that you don't know anything. And that sort of skepticism is the type of thing that I want to avoid, and it's also neither of our views. So that's how I go about approaching any debate. As far as morality is concerned, my starting point is realism, because when I think about moral questions, like if I ask myself this, if everyone in the world, if the Nazis won and everyone in the world approved of the Holocaust, would that in fact make the Holocaust good? Obviously, we'd believe it was good, but would it actually make it true that it was good? And when I reflect on that, it seems obvious the answer is no. Like, the Holocaust was terrible. It would still be bad. We would just be confused about that. So, like, obviously, phenomenal conservatism leaves room for that seeming to be defeated. Maybe I'm confused. Maybe there's some explanation for that seeming that means that it should be undermined somehow. But that's my starting point. It just seems that some things are bad, independent of our views. And I haven't heard a defeater that I thought was compelling enough that I was willing to abandon that belief. So that's why I'm a moral realist.
Yeah, I have some potential pushback on that, but I think Pat might have something a bit more competent than what I might be about to say. Pat, just before you start talking, would you be able to put some earphones in potentially if you got some? Because I think when I talk or when Connor talks, there's sound coming from your screen.
I have a microphone, so if I put earphones on, doesn't that mess with the microphone? Because I'm using one.
All the earphones will do is it will stop. It's just that when me or Connor speak, we can hear our voice echoing, I think, from your microphone. It's like your microphone is picking up the laptop.
Can you just mute me when someone else is talking?
All right, we'll do that. That's fine. Yeah, Pat, do you have any pushback to what Connor was just saying there about say everyone believed that the Holocaust was good? Connor would say it would still just be objectively bad, regardless of what people were saying.
Sorry, just to clarify, I'm not just asserting that it's bad. I'm saying I believe that it's bad because it seems to me that it's bad, and I don't have a adequate defeater for that seeming. So, like, that's how I go about justifying that belief. I'm not just going, moral realism is true. Like, that wouldn't even really be an argument.
Seeming bad is not really an argument either. Like, you're sort of begging the question. You're sort of presenting a conclusion without giving the argument. So I don't know why I would believe in moral realism just because you think Nazis are bad, which is kind of the argument I'm getting from what you said.
Well, okay, I'd be interested to know how you go about justifying any of your beliefs. Because it's not begging the question, because begging the question is when you include your conclusion in one of your premises. But my conclusion is moral realism is true, and my premise is that it seems that it's true, but those are two distinct things. And I'm saying seemings are a source of justification.
It seems like very close to begging the question. But yeah, I would explain my view on anti-realism as I think people's values are based on their preferences. And when I say something is wrong or bad, I mean it's wrong or bad on my own preferences. And I don't think like this need for like a comfortable view on morality to make us like psychologically more comfortable that something's objectively morally wrong is a proper argument for moral realism. Like, just because I think factory farming is disgusting and I'm morally against it myself, that doesn't mean like I automatically would say that there's a universal standard, universal objective morality. But I'm still like a bit confused about the Nazi thing. Like, can you just break it down a little bit more? Why, like, just what exactly you mean by that?
So like I reflect on whether or not on the moral properties of the Holocaust in a scenario where everyone approves of it, and it strikes me that it would still be bad. Obviously, I had sensed that we're a bit suspicious of this way of going about justifying beliefs. But to be clear, like, there are other things that I think we can all take for granted that I can't really explain how I know. So like, how do I know that there are no true contradictions? Well, I think about the nature of contradictions and the nature of truth, and it just seems obvious that there are no true contradictions. So like, I think we have a rational capacity to understand some non-natural facts.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but your moral reasoning is based on your mind. So
yeah, Connor.
Yeah, obviously, I need a mind to form a belief. Obviously, this is like why.
Yeah. So if you don't have a source other than your mind, I don't understand how you're a moral realist.
Well, here's one thing I think I mentioned to you, Pat, when we discussed this, right? Is the answer to 1 + 1 objectively 2, or is it subjectively 2?
By mathematical standards, it would be objectively 2. But then I said that there was a difference between descriptive statements and normative statements.
Yeah, explain kind of why. Okay. If that would be objectively true by mathematical standards, why is it not objectively true by moral standards that the Holocaust was bad? Why is 1 + 1 objectively 2 in mathematical standards, but then the Holocaust is not objectively bad?
In the same way, like, I know my car is parked outside. There's no one on earth that would come here and see that and think differently unless they had some kind of disease that made their brain map onto the world differently from everybody else's. Whereas with something like the Holocaust is bad, there's a moral element to it. And how you justify that moral element relies on your preferences and how you view it. When Hitler looks at it, he thinks it's good, which shows you that
why
is universal.
Because he lacks empathy. So that's a defect of his brain. In the same way that the person is saying your car is not parked outside, Hitler is not capable of making the rational decision because he was ultimately born with, it must have been like a smaller amygdala or something than other people, which is the part of your brain responsible for processing empathy. He had the inability to put himself in the shoes of all those Jews that he gassed to death. He wasn't able to. So he was essentially born with what we could call a cognitive impairment. I think people with empathy can call people who just watch, I don't know, animal slaughter footage and stuff like that. I think we have within our right to say that those people are cognitively impaired and that they're poor judges of, in the same way, let's say someone was born with a defect that meant they couldn't judge depth perception correctly. So they might think that the space between this desk here and this wall is very large or something, and if they were to jump across it, they might die. But that would just be objectively wrong because they've got the depth perception part of their brain isn't working properly. Can we not just say the same thing about empathy, which is what's needed to make moral judgments?
Well, but we have rigorous scientific standards and testing for things like gravity and things that then claims that scientists make. We don't have quite the same method of testing in morality. We only have moral philosophy.
Well, but what I'm saying is there could exist a method of testing this. And I think I mentioned this to you last time we spoke as well. The method of testing this was, let's say we had a group of people in the room who knew there was 4 people who knew all possible outcomes of a situation, and they had very high empathy. And there was 4 other people who knew all possible outcomes of the situation, but they had very low empathy. The part of their brain, the amygdala or whatever it is, was smaller than those others. the ones with the high empathy will just universally reach the same conclusion that murder is wrong, or that murdering animals or farming them or whatever is wrong, because they know all the possible outcomes of any given situation. And we can actually measure in their brain physically, scientifically, that they're able to emphasize. And the part of their brain that's able to empathize with the victim in any scenario is saying that this is wrong. Why would that not be a rigorous way of just testing that they were right about
that could be a rigorous way of showing one group of people is more empathetic than the other, but your value of therefore these people are better, or this is my morally preferred way of being, which is to be more empathetic and to be good to animals, that is a subjective element, because what else would you be appealing to apart from your own mind? And there'll be people that disagree with you and say, actually, I think it's good to be cruel to animals. So
yeah,
authority
and
there?
Those people lack empathy, so they're not a good judge. It's like a blind person saying, I can see this in front of me, when they can't. As someone who's morally blind.
What's that based on? You're just saying empathy is good because it's good.
No, physical property, a part of their brain. So it's a fully physical thing, biological thing.
Yeah, so that's a descriptive statement, but your normative claim that therefore people with bigger empathy portions in their brain are better, or this is a better way to be, that's the subjective part. And if it's not, then how is it not subjective?
Okay, is it objective or subjective that a blind person cannot see as well as a non-blind person?
A person that can see better than a blind person.
Yeah. That would be objectively true, right? That a non-blind person can see better than a blind person.
Yeah, but descriptive statements are easier to say whether they're objectively true or not. They're easier to ascertain just by the nature of like the physical world.
So maybe what I'm not understanding here is the difference between it being objectively true that a non-blind person can see better than a blind person, and that a person with empathy who makes decisions based on empathy is just objectively morally better than a person who lacks empathy and does not have the physical capability to actually make moral decisions.
One's an empirical claim about your sight that no one is going to disagree with ever, and one is a claim about values, which people will always dispute because values are subjective.
And those people
sorry, it's not like I just
objectively
jumped in
wrong.
on this. I got some things to say about that. So I'm with Pat that I don't think that you can gain moral knowledge through empirical inquiry. I'm not a moral naturalist, I'm a non-naturalist. So I think that we understand values through rational reflection. Much like how, I'm going to just keep using this example because I think it's a good example of non-natural fact, but I don't know that there's no true contradictions because I looked under a rock and it said it. Like I think about it and it seems true. However, the move that then I disagree with Pat is saying, look, okay, so morality isn't an empirical domain and people disagree about it. Therefore, we have reason to think that it's subjective. Because I think there are loads of non-natural facts that seem objectively true, like the one I just said, or nothing can be completely green and completely red all at the same time. That's not an empirical fact. Even if I went into the universe and looked at everything in the universe and saw nothing was completely red and completely green at the same time, that would tell me that nothing is completely red and completely green at the same time. It wouldn't tell me nothing can be. The reason I know nothing can be is because of my rational intuition. And also, like, people disagree about a lot of things. Like, people disagree about whether or not God exists, but presumably there's a correct answer. Someone's wrong about that.
Yeah.
I don't think disagreement really implies subjectivism. And actually, if you look at subjective domains, we often don't really sincerely disagree. Like, I have food tastes. I don't like mushrooms, but when someone says that they like mushrooms, I don't sincerely disagree with them. I might joke and say yeah, you're dumb for liking mushrooms. But I recognize whilst we're having a conversation, there's no real fact in that. But when someone says oh no, animals don't matter, I actually do sincerely disagree with them. The same way that I would disagree about someone who thinks that the Greek pantheon are real or something like this.
Yeah. So I think just going off what Connor was saying there, Pat, do you not think that you could be making an appeal to popularity somewhere within your argument?
Because disagreement is not my strongest argument for moral anti-realism. That was just a point that I was making. So yeah, I agree. Like, disagreement doesn't mean that doesn't prove it either way.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay. Connor, what is your kind of strongest contention to anything that maybe Pat has said so far about morals being subjective?
Well, I mean, I covered most of the disagreement stuff. One thing I am interested in hearing about is like, I feel like Pat isn't on board with me using seemings or appearances as sources of justification. And I'd be interested to know what you use as a bedrock source of justification, or if you are just like a global skeptic. Like, are there any premises that you just take to be true? And if so, why?
Not necessarily with normative claims. Like, I think they all boil down to preferences. I think some preferences are better than others. But I don't think there is a mind-independent source of moral value. And I think most serious moral realists will make that claim. So the whole contention with moral realists and anti-realists is whether you can point to anything other than the human, or I say sentient mind, because I think animals have moral intuitions, for their source of moral value. So if you're sort of, and your whole thing about seeming, using seeming, what that term that you used for justifications of belief, I just think it's a weak justification when we have stronger, more rigorous arguments in anti-realism, because there's not that much to prove with anti-realism. Like, we all exist, we all have preferences, therefore morality is based on our preferences, and until we find like a magical orb that dictates what is morally right or wrong, I don't see any reason to divert from that.
Right, but some of those premises, like, okay, we all exist. How do you justify that belief? Because I'm thinking you're justifying it because it seems to you that it's true, and you don't have a good enough reason to doubt it. Like, it just seems obvious. I agree, it does seem obvious.
Yeah.
But I think that justifies that belief.
Yeah. So it's kind of a question about epistemology and what is reasonable to be believed in a specific situation. So I'm what you call a epistemic contextualist. So epistemic sorry, I can't talk in my braces. Epistemic contextualism is an approach to knowledge which says that you don't have to know every single thing about the world, every single deep question to know that your car is parked outside, or to know there's a microphone in front of me. So the standard or the burden that you need to prove is dependent on the context. So in this kind of casual conversation, if I tell George that I'm seeing Hamilton next week in October, he can probably take that to be true. If I'm in a court of law, then the standard is a lot higher. If I'm in some very serious, AI lab where the knowledge needs to be really, really succinct and really, really accurate, the standard changes again. So I think this is a reasonable approach, because it doesn't require me to justify things to what I think is a very unreasonable belief, because like, if you're not working within this framework, people can just say, if you don't know if there's a God or not, or if you don't know whether you're in the base reality and not in the multiverse, then how do you know you had orange juice? Which I think is ridiculous. So
yeah, but that does sound compatible with phenomenal conservatism. I could say that the standards for knowledge are higher in high stakes situations, but how do I get that knowledge? Well, it's because like some things seem obvious to me and I don't have reasons to doubt them. Like, how do you go about justifying it? Contextualism is like a standard for knowledge, but how do you go about actually justifying some of your bedrock beliefs?
With your particular framework, I don't know a lot about, what's it called? Conservatism?
Phenomenal conservatism.
Phenomenal conservatism. It seems to me that something has important. Sorry? What's that?
Is that an interesting choice of words?
It sounds a bit arrogant, Connor. No, it's not just conservatism, it's phenomenal conservatism.
Yeah. I mean, I think the phrase means phenomena as in appearances, and then conservatism is like taking things as they are without, and like just assuming that things are as they are until you have reason to doubt it.
Oh, it's a different semantic meaning when I say seem.
It's not like related to politics or anything.
Yeah, no. For something as important as whether morals are objective or not, or whether they're subjective and very important philosophical questions, I would think that you would need something more than it just seems that way.
Connor, I actually have a question for Connor, actually, that can kind of maybe help him explain this, what you've just asked, Pat, because this would be good for him to clarify. Now, recently I saw a debate between Vegan Gains and that pro-extinction guy. Not in Mendham. There's literally a channel by this Indian dude called Steve called Pro-Extinction. And Pro-Extinction was arguing that like rape is objectively bad, and you can't compare it to something as trivial as whether pineapple on pizza is bad or good. Vegan Gains made to what many people would see as an absolutely outrageous claim that whether you see rape as good or bad is the same as the preference as is pineapple on a pizza good or bad. Now, as outrageous as that might sound, if moral subjectivists are right about what they say, then he actually has the point. Connor, you mentioned the mushroom thing a while ago. What is it for you that makes the Holocaust objectively bad, but preference for mushrooms subjective? Why is that? What's the difference?
Yeah, I mean, the main difference is that if I imagine a world where everyone likes mushrooms, it doesn't seem like mushrooms are disgusting, even though I happen to not like mushrooms right now. Whereas if I think of a world where everyone approves of the Holocaust, it does seem like it's still bad. And Pat said that like seemings, I was like, we should have a very high standard for considering that we have moral knowledge, and seemings doesn't seem like a very good, like not good enough justification for it. But I mean, it seems that moralism is true to me, and it doesn't seem that anti-realism is true. So like anti-realism has even less justification. And considering that I think that appearances are the only source of justification, I think that I think it is good enough.
Well, Connor, I'd just like to push back on what you said, because I think that your answer there, that's even to me, even though I lean towards objectivism, that seems still a bit wishy-washy to me about imagine a world where everyone likes mushrooms and imagine a world where no one thought the Holocaust was bad, blah, blah, blah. I actually still think that the difference here could be based on biology and actual physical things about the brain that we can examine. If you had the people who had the best taste receptors in the world, which is the thing we use to judge taste or whatever, they could have the absolute best taste receptors in the world. We put all those people in a room. They would all actually arrive at different conclusions about the taste of mushrooms, whether they're good or bad, or pineapple on pizza. The same cannot be said about the Holocaust. If you put 5 people with the most empathy in the world in the room, they would just unanimously, it's universal, agree that the Holocaust is bad because of a physical capability that they have in their brain. So that is what I would consider the key difference there. It's a physical thing. That's why preference for mushrooms or pineapple on pizza is subjective to me. But I still am leaning towards, Pat, the idea that the Holocaust or whatever is just objectively bad, because there's no person with any good amount of empathy who would say that it was good.
I mean, I would say on I mean, I don't know what you mean by best taste receptors. Like, I don't know what the standard of taste receptor would even be.
Well, we can measure them physically.
I guess like not being able to taste would be bad, but like if you have intense taste receptors, like I guess the best taste receptors would be if they had very intense taste and everything tasted good. Like that would probably be the best scenario.
Well, no, because they were still all right. Things would still taste different to those people with the best taste receptors, the most, the highest amount of taste receptors. You know how all different animals have a different level of taste receptors, and some people taste things more strongly than others. They would still, all the people with the highest amount of taste receptors or the strongest taste receptors, whatever you want to call it, who would be there's still no way to call them the best judge of whether mushrooms are good. But I think people with empathy, those are the best judges of whether something is good or bad. And when someone says to me, oh, it's just subjective that what happens to animals is bad. Oh, I watched Dominion and I didn't feel anything. So, prove to me that it's immoral. I'm saying that that person has some kind of cognitive impairment, essentially. They're not born with the capacity that I have been born with to make moral judgments. And it's different with mushrooms. You could have two people who have the exact same capability to taste something, but they would still arrive at different conclusions that mushrooms are good or bad.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's kind of zeroing in on the same point. It's like an interesting way of illustrating it. But like, I think the difference is that when you just think about taste as a domain and you think about morality as a domain, it strikes us that there are some right answers to moral questions and there aren't right answers to taste questions. And like, you're not wrong for thinking mushrooms are disgusting, but it does seem that you're wrong for thinking that the Holocaust is good. It seems like you have a false belief.
I think subjectivists aren't going to be satisfied with your claim about, about just stuff seeming this way.
I want to comment a little bit more on this seeming thing, because I don't have a problem with the seeming thing. I just want to know if it is your view that your seemingness, like that argument, is reliant on your own brain. And I know you're going to say yes, because it has to be, but are you making a claim to some other source, moral feature of the world that exists that dictates right and wrong? Because that's ultimately what moral realism is. If that's not what you mean, then I'm not even sure that you are a moral realist in the way that's like traditionally discussed in the literature.
Yeah, so I think that I'm referencing non-natural facts. So like, obviously it's not like a physical thing. And yeah, like I need my mind to reflect on it, but I also need my mind to reflect on, the rules of logic. But I don't think the rules of logic are subjective. They're not like a physical thing, but they're rules that we understand through rational reflection. And if you think that modus ponens is a invalid form of inference, you're just wrong about that. You're just confused. So,
but logic is the tool we use to help determine what's true or false. It's not like determining what's right or wrong. So it's kind of different to like a claim to a normative objective source. Logic is a mathematical tool.
So your point is, okay, non-natural facts exist and we can understand non-natural facts through rational reflection. However, normative non-natural facts don't exist and we can't understand those through rational reflection. Is that what you're saying?
All I want to know is, what are you like basing your claim on about moral objectivity if it's not just your own head? Like what is it? Is it a feature of the world? Is it a belief?
Yeah.
Is it a substance? Like, that's what I want to know.
It's a feature. It's like a necessary non-natural truth. It's a feature of the world that's true in all possible worlds.
And that is what though? Like,
I don't understand the question.
Exactly, because it's just your own belief of it.
Yeah, but so are my beliefs of maths, but like that doesn't make it subjective or not true.
Well, it does if you can't point to your moral source. That's the whole problem with moral realism, because they make these claims like.
But where's my source of my understanding of logic? Like
dependent on my mind. Where is it? Oh, I don't know. It just exists. Like that's exactly the problem.
What would your?
Let me just make this point. He says it's in his head. And I say, is it something outside your head as well? And he says, yes. I say, where is it? And he's like, oh, it just exists. Like, that's kind of the entire point. That's the entire thing of begging the question. It's just there somewhere.
I don't think, though, Connor would be understanding there what your difference is there for explaining why mathematical statements are true or false. All right, so Pat, let me give you an example. If Connor would just waltz into now a Harvard lecture on maths and slap the chalk out of the lecturer's hand as he writes his nerdy little equation on the chalkboard, and Connor then says to the classroom, actually, no, 26 times 2.0 squared multiplied by x third times by pi is not this. It's actually this. Why? Because I say it is, and it just seems to me that it is. What would be your problem with that.
Okay, imagine Gary Yourofsky giving a lecture. I'm trying to think of someone very moral, and then like Hamas, a member of Hamas walks in and tries to interrupt him and gives him a lecture on moral philosophy. Like, of course, I'm going to disagree with that, and of course, I think we have certain norms and certain values that are good for a Western society. I don't think that proves moral realism or anti-realism. And I've told you my view on maths as well. Like, even the strongest subjects in science, like gravity, things that evolution, we're still discovering new things every day. So it has that flexibility that I don't see moral realism has, because they're making a claim to universal type of rules. Whereas with science, it's easier to, the way science is objective is like it's still open to being refined and changed. And that's the whole point of scientific query.
But
so
we
it's
can
not
say
really
that with morality, though.
Yeah, morality has been revised and changed over time as well. And interestingly, like ever since the Age of Enlightenment, when we started taking reason seriously and rational reflection seriously, our moral beliefs converged very suddenly on liberal views. And I think the explanation for that is because liberal views are correct.
With that, there's like the parallel argument that that's more evidence that anti-realism is real, because morality is always changing. So you have that argument, but then there's a parallel argument. It's still not a very good argument either way.
But descriptive beliefs are always changing. And then we hit the Age of Enlightenment, and then they all converged on our scientific worldview. And the same thing happened to morality. So like,
in the Western world, but in much of the world is like a shithole still. So
but okay, but you said a moment ago, Pat, that science is always changing, ever evolving, and we're finding new answers to things. So how can you draw the distinction between, because you think gravity is objective, and yeah, I think me and Connor would both acknowledge that that's true.
Objective and open to being refined, yes.
Okay, how is this different to morality?
Moral objectivists are making the claim. My main objection to moral realism is the claim it makes to something outside the mind. So if you're not making that claim and you just think like some morals are really, really good and we should always just have them, I'm not going to have an issue with that, because I live my life as a moral realist. Like, I feel very strongly about the things I feel strongly about, and I probably live my life more like a moral realist than actual moral realists. But my main objection is to a mind-independent source. And gravity doesn't make that claim. Like, scientists don't make that claim to things that we can't see or rigorously test in some way. Whereas moral realists will just say, I have this belief, it seems really wrong, for example. What do I point to? Well, it's what my moral reasoning, and I also think there's something that exists which I can't prove. Whereas with gravity, if I throw a ball over a balcony, it's going to fall down every time. There's some kind of rigorous testing there, and it'll consistently do that every single time. There's never going to be a time where it's not going to do that, or else you can't have the same rigorous type of testing with morality.
Well, I'm saying that you can, because people with high empathy would universally arrive at the same conclusion that the Holocaust was bad. There's not one single person in the room of the people with the highest empathy who would say that the Holocaust was good.
You still run into the same problem. Like, what are you using to say that empathy is the ultimate judge, apart from your own brain?
The same thing that you're using about the gravity thing. It's science. It's not my brain, it's their brain. It's the people who are saying the Holocaust was bad. We can physically measure in their brain that they're making the right judgment, because they have higher empathy receptors in their brain than people who think that it was good. So the people who think that it was good, they're cognitively impaired. They just lack physically, biologically, the same thing that if there was less gravity, the ball would float.
And why is empathy better than non-empathy? Like, what are you using to measure that? Well,
that would ultimately be, dare I say, begging the question, because that's just going to lead to a circular thing. Because that's just what good or bad means.
That is begging the question. You're not telling me why I should believe empathy is the ultimate source of moral value. You're just saying this is my axiomatic value.
Well, I don't know what right or wrong is unless it's based on empathy, in the same way I don't know what mathematics is if it's not based on numbers. So there's no way I can answer it without begging the question. If someone was to say to me, George, why is red a color? I wouldn't know how to answer that, other than by saying, because it's a color. So if someone says to me, George, why is empathy the best judge of why moral facts are true or false, I don't know how to really answer that, because that's just what morality is. It's about whether we have we judge things based on being right or wrong based on the amount of empathy we've had. Psychopaths, who we can actually study scientifically, they lack the necessary capability physically to be able to make moral judgments. So they feel nothing when they torture someone in a dark basement somewhere. They just don't feel anything. They're just objectively bad, you could say. But so I don't know if that explanation will satisfy you at all, but it satisfies me at present, because I don't know. I just don't know what morality is unless it's based on that. Otherwise, what the hell is morality?
Well, to me, you just gave an argument for your own moral reasoning that you think empathy is good, and therefore you're going to judge everything from empathy because you personally think that. You haven't pointed to a source of moral value that can be objective.
Well, the same as a scientist could say, I believe that gravity is objectively true.
Well, that's fine. There's lots of disagreements in science about gravity and about string theory and quantum mechanics. That doesn't
but I would sound like a lunatic if I said gravity isn't true and then I jumped off a balcony and died. I would just be a lunatic for saying that.
Yeah, because that's provable. Your normative claims aren't provable in the same way gravity is, because all you have to say is empathy. Like, that's all you have. Whereas scientists have like years and years of showing that gravity exists and like rigorous testing. You just have your opinion. It's literally your opinion.
It's okay. How do we go about proving that there's no true contradictions? Like, do you have a way of proving that, or do you believe that's subjective?
There are no true contradictions. Can you give me an example? What you mean by that?
Like, name the trait, for example. Would name the trait be a good example, Connor?
No, I would go for something more simple. So, like,
okay,
it's true that the Earth is flat and the Earth is a globe at the same time.
Right.
Like,
so the law
can't
of
both be true at the same time.
Yeah. So I think it would be easier to find true, descriptive contradictions. So I don't know. I have a shape. It's a square and a circle, or something like that. Is that kind of what you're
right? But the fact that there can't be true contradictions, I'm not saying that there aren't any true contradictions. Like, that is something that would be an empirical question. I suppose we'd have to make a list of every possible contradiction, which would presumably be like almost infinite. And then you'd go around looking at everything and seeing if they're all consistent. But the belief that there can't be, that it's impossible for there to be a true contradiction, that's not an empirical. That's not something you can understand through like empirical means. However, I think it's objectively true. But like, you're saying like, I'm referencing this kind of moral reality, this source that's outside of my mind. Where is the fact that there's no true contradictions? I don't know, like nowhere, everywhere. Like it is true, and I understand it through rational reflection. It doesn't come from like a place. But I don't think the fact that I don't really have a satisfying answer for that means that it's subjective or it's a matter of opinion whether or not there are true contradictions.
And I just want to add, actually, Pat, the fact that both myself and Connor are both fallible, that wouldn't necessarily mean that we're actually wrong or that we aren't right about why objective morality is true in both the cases we believe it to be true. Yes, you mentioned there hasn't been some kind of scientifically rigorous method tested, or this is just my own opinion. But I'm ultimately saying that this is why I believe morality to be objective. And it just doesn't make that. And I could well be wrong. I've said this loads of times. You could absolutely be right about everything here that we're discussing. You could be right, and it's all just subjective stuff. But that no less, just because I'm fallible about this, makes me believe any less than my theory about why objective morality is real is true.
So just like a quick comment on this, there are no true contradictions. Even if that is true, I think it's like quite a leap to go from that to therefore moral realism, because things can exist as concepts and we can understand them, but I don't see how that proves moral realism. Like, what?
I'm not saying it proves moral realism. I'm saying it refutes your objection to moral realism. Your objection to moral realism is like, there can't be facts that are non-natural that are like
I didn't say that can't be. I said if that's not moral realism,
you think it's weird or something.
That wasn't my argument. I didn't say that. All
Okay,
I said was if moral realism relies on a mind-independent source, they have not proved that. So they have not proved
right. Okay. So you think
that
we haven't proved that
there are
there's
no
no
contracts,
contradictions?
or that we can't think in an abstract way.
Right. So what's the difference between the contradiction scenario and the moral scenario? Like, if we haven't proved morality through rational reflection, how have we proved that there's no true contradictions through rational reflection, even though that's a non-natural fact? Because I think it's proved. I'm happy to just accept it.
I don't see how they're like equivalent to each other. There are no true contradictions and a mind-independent source of moral realism. Like they're completely different things. One is like logically deductible as well, like no true contradictions. If you could put premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. Moral realism is a normative claim to something which you cannot prove exists.
Right, but what's the source of our belief that there are no true contradictions? Do you think the source is because it's true, or because it's just like a subjective attitude inside our minds?
Because of how we understand language and what we know to be true and something else can't be true. So therefore, it's like a logically deducible position. The claim to a normative source, which you can't show or touch or prove, we just have to take your word for it, is a bit more difficult to swallow, I guess.
Yeah. So this is what I was trying to like touch on earlier on. So it seems that like the fact that something doesn't exist in the natural world and this physical stuff, like there are non-natural facts, like the rules of logic, or there are no true contradictions.
It's a possibility. Like moral realism is a possibility, right? In the field of possibilities. I don't think it is probable. I haven't heard a good argument for it. That's kind of my position. It doesn't mean that I don't understand it as a concept. Like if I one day write a fiction book, maybe my world will be a moral realist one, because I think it would be really nice if moral realism did exist, and if that was a good argument for it. It doesn't mean I don't understand it existing as a concept. I just think it is hard to prove in a way that matters.
Right, but I just feel like our source of justification for the rules of logic, even though they're non-natural facts, are the same as the moral facts. But it sounds like the delineation you're drawing is saying, okay, some non-natural facts are fine if they're not normative, but normative non-natural facts, they're weird. And I like that for some reason is like, we can't use rational reflection for normative non-natural facts, but we can use rational reflection for non-normative non-natural facts. God, there's a lot of nons in there. Sorry about that.
It's a little bit hard to follow, honestly. Like, I think we can think in an abstract way, and I appreciate the idea of moral. I don't think the idea of moral realism is incoherent, or that it's like unstable, or it's not on good foundations, or there's not a good, if it was true, that it wouldn't be good for the world or something like that. I just think proving the argument for moral realism is very difficult. And the one you came up with, it just seems like it's correct. Like, come on. And I know that's how you feel. And I'm not sure that is a real argument, though. Like, that's just an intuition you have, which is fine. Like, we all have beliefs based on intuition. Some people are just Christian because they believe in Christ or something like that. But I just don't think I've heard a rigorous argument for moral realism. Whereas with anti-realism, it's just descriptively true. Like, we're all individuals and we have preferences. Therefore, we use our brain and we make decisions, and our morals are going to be subjective to our minds. So there's not really much for the anti-realist to prove, because like we're kind of living the reality and we're not making a claim to something we can't show.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, George, go ahead.
Sure, yeah, I'll just ask quickly, because I think this will help my audience kind of distinguish between how you believe things are objective or subjective, Pat. If I was to say that I'm Chinese, would that be objective or would I be? Is that objective or is it subjective? Like that, assuming that you believe that I'm not Chinese, would you be objectively right that I'm not Chinese, or would you be subjectively right that I'm not Chinese?
I don't know what you are. You could be Chinese for all I know. But just say I know that you
well, that accent, come on.
I mean, I'm not Chinese, right? I'll tell you now, I'm not Chinese. But if I was to believe that I was Chinese, and I said, no, seriously, Pat, I'm Chinese, am I like you obviously believe that I'm wrong there. I'm making a nonsensical statement on purpose, right? Just to test how you differentiate. Am I subjectively wrong that I'm Chinese, or am I objectively wrong that I'm Chinese?
You're objectively wrong based on standards we know about race and culture.
Okay, how are you distinguish? Okay, but then
it's a descriptive statement. That's why it's easier. So I'm not saying descriptive statements are always like easier and they're the easiest thing in the world, but they're generally easier to prove why someone is right or wrong than normative statements, just by virtue, by nature of the way they are.
And now let's go with another Chinese example. Let's say I say boiling dogs alive at Yulin Festival is immoral. Am I objectively right about that, or am I subjectively right about that?
I agree with you because we share similar subjective values on many issues.
I'm still really not kind of understanding what, because you, even with the Chinese thing about me being Chinese, your answer is essentially that I'm objectively wrong based on a shared understanding of stuff. So if your basis for something is shared understanding, then I'm not seeing what the difference is here.
Yes, okay. So if your view on moral realism is everyone has a shared understanding of particular values, then I don't have any objection to moral realism. I don't like him, but Alex O'Connor debated, I don't know if it was Sam Harris or someone else, and he was saying how something can have the appearance of supporting moral realism when an entire society agrees how to act on certain values. So we all, agree that Nazism is terrible and the Holocaust was terrible, and we collectively agree that now. But the more accurate thing for me is to say we all share those subjective values. But a moral realist might say, oh no, this is evidence of, moral realism because we have a shared understanding. But if all moral realism is to you, George, is a shared understanding of values, then I don't have an issue with your view on moral realism. What I have an issue is
I go a step further and I say, like, if everyone agreed but had a shared value that actually the Holocaust was good, we'd all just be wrong about that. Like, we'd have a false belief.
Yeah, whereas I would say I would just disagree with everyone, like how I disagree with everyone on Israel and the Palestine issue. Like, I think Israel are in the right and Palestine's in the wrong, and that's my subjective view on it. It doesn't matter how many people are going to support Palestine over Israel. It's because I have subjective values and views on that particular thing.
Okay, well, that's a good thing for me to get into. What would
I don't have loads of knowledge about the area, by the way, so I don't know how I'm useful. I'm going to be talking about this conflict.
No, that's fine. We're not here to actually talk about that. It's more
just about
the subject. Yeah. But I do have a question on that. What would give you the right then, Pat, if you just believe that that's your subjective opinion, that Israel is the side in the right here, what would even give you any kind of right? Because this is the main thing that objectivists, particularly non-vegan objectivists, often who believe in God, say.
Yeah.
What then, Pat, would even give you the right to say to, I don't know, a Hamas supporter, what would give you like any kind of right to say that you're wrong or something, any more than just saying someone who disagrees with you on your favorite color is wrong? Why would you, Pat, not just say, well, yeah, I prefer Israel, but you prefer Hamas, so that's cool?
Apples and oranges. So in the real world, I would like to just draw attention to the fact that this is so irrelevant, this entire discussion on who gets a right to say what. Like, no one is going to ask what is your meta-ethical position on Palestine, Israel. It's about who has power. So like, it's so irrelevant to how the real world actually works, this meta-ethical, like, nuanced discussion. And secondly, it's not the job of philosophy to be persuasive or to help animal rights people, for example, or to help, be more compassionate or something. Like, the point of philosophy is about intellectual integrity and strong argumentation. Like, it's not philosophy's job to help you become a persuasive activist. And that's hard for activists to understand because their whole world revolves around vegan activism or whatever it is. But that's just the truth of it. It's like, sometimes I feel with moral realists, they want to believe in something because it's more comfortable or it's more like rewarding, but that's not a good reason to believe in something. And it's equivalent to people believing in God because it gives them more comfort, when I don't think there are good arguments for God or for Jesus being the savior or something like that. So I don't think we should use philosophy and logic. Like, they're tools to determine what's true or false, and they can help you form very strong argumentations, but they're not there to make you like feel good about what you believe in or to provide something that it's not really their job to provide. Like, philosophy is philosophy and persuasive advocacy is something completely different. And I can't just be a moral realist just because I want to say that factory farming is wrong.
But maybe I need you to be more clear in your answer there to the question, because I haven't understood something. I'm still not understanding what it is that would. How come when someone says they support Hamas, because you get pissed off with someone who, if they support Hamas, and you would call them a fucking idiot and every name under the sun, right?
Mm.
Why not just shrug your shoulders and say, well, that's the same as someone saying blue is the best color and you think red is? Like, why not just go, oh, you support Hamas? Yeah, I mean, I don't agree, but that's cool.
Because I think there is a different moral weight to something like the Israel-Palestine conflict and religious terrorism than apples and oranges.
And then the objectivist will ask, how do you base moral weight? How do you ground moral weight, or something like that?
And
this is what happens.
And it's based on my preference, and I have no shame in that because I know it's the honest, most truthful answer I can give. And I don't like your question is framed in such a way that the only way something can have any seriousness or any weight is that if there is an objective standard, when that's just not how the world works, like, frankly, and it's not what I think. Like, I don't think there needs to be a moral objective standard for actions to matter, because we can collectively agree on things.
So what would you say to a carnist in a debate then who just said to you something like, why do you have the right to tell me what to eat?
So my aim as an anti-realist, and I come at it from that perspective, is to draw a contradiction based on their own beliefs. It's not to say this is wrong and it's objectively wrong and here is why, and I don't believe my own arguments, so I'm not going to say that. I'm going to draw a contradiction on what they believe. So would you eat a dog? No. Why would you eat a disabled person? Would you eat a child? And it's very easy to get them to run into a contradiction. And if they still don't care after that, there's not really much you can do. You just move on to the next person.
Sure.
So you have a different purpose as an anti-realist as opposed to a moral objectivist.
And then what would you say to someone who said, well, why do contradictions or inconsistent beliefs even matter? If it's all just subjective, what, like that, then you trying to find a contradiction in my beliefs using name the trait or whatever. So no, I would not, mass murder a human with the exact IQ, humans with the exact IQ of a pig, blah, blah, blah. How is that any more different to me just saying red is my favorite color? However, I prefer this blue shirt to this red one.
So it's dependent on their values. If they're okay with being a hypocrite, there's nothing I can do after that. And I move on to the next person. Like, there's absolutely nothing you can do to a person that says, oh, I don't care if this being has the same like cognizance as a 5-year-old. Like, just walk away and talk to a fucking psychopath.
Right.
Unless
But also, like, if subjectivism is true, you're also committed to saying that the person who says, I have inconsistent views, but I just don't really care. Like, you're committed to saying that they're not really making any kind of error. They're not making any kind of rational mistake.
Yeah, you can be a rational psychopath. You can be a rational racist. Like, if you think black people are inferior and you want to treat them worse, that is a rational thing for you to do. That's what rationality is. I don't think it's got anything to do with morality. It's separate.
But if you have two conflicting beliefs that can't be true at the same time, like maybe they think that species is irrelevant and I wouldn't eat a person who has the IQ of a pig, but I think it's fine to eat pigs because I just don't care that they're inconsistent beliefs. Like, the reason I want to hold consistent beliefs is because if you have inconsistent beliefs, one of them is false. But if morality is subjective, then like, why care about consistent beliefs? Like, you could just value whatever you want, and then you can have inconsistent beliefs, and like, you're not making any kind of rational mistake. But I want to say, like, they are being irrational.
Well, just because someone's an anti-realist doesn't mean they don't have good values. Like, we probably have a lot in common in our values. We just disagree on the meta-ethics. So I have a preference for a world with less violence towards animals. I have a preference for justice, and I don't want to use those sappy words like compassion and kindness. It always gets thrown around and bounces into my head. I have a preference for happiness over suffering. But that's what it boils down to, and I don't have any like qualms about it. I'm not like, oh my god, it's just based on a preference. Like that's just what I'm going to argue. And I think you can, this whole thing about, okay, this is another thing I wanted to bring up. It's kind of an empirical claim we're making when we say that it's going to be less persuasive if we use the anti-realist argument as opposed to a more moral objectivist argument, because it's kind of 50-50 in the people that I meet that are actually across this area, whether they're moral realists or anti-realists. So that tells me like it's maybe 50-50 in the wider population as well. And people don't actually really care about this issue, about whether it's not really going to affect them that much if they're going to go vegan or not. Like we treat it as like, oh, we can't say, if we have to say it's down to a preference, then it's going to mean everything. But I haven't seen that. And lots of people get convinced by having their values exposed as hypocritical. So I think there's strengths to, if you want to go down, like, I don't like the moral realist stuff, but if you wanted to go down, there's probably strengths to that. But I also think there's strengths to the anti-realist argument, and we shouldn't make this assumption that it's going to be less persuasive when we don't actually know that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Probably, I find that moralists tend to be more concerned about having consistent views of morality, but I don't think you need to frame morality as objective in order to convince people. And even if it were the case that convincing people moralism meant that they are more likely to adopt your view, that wouldn't really say anything about whether moral realism itself is true. So like this is
like an intellectual like circle jerk, basically, like the whole moral subjectivity and anti-realist argument. Like it's very like a philosophical intellectual debate. Like I don't know how much it actually has impact on like real world policy, like animal rights.
I mean, like you say, Pat, like most people share similar ideas. I think that they intuit obvious moral truths that like suffering is disvaluable and pleasure is good and freedom is good and things like this. But like that, whether or not that's true is kind of empirically indistinguishable from if everyone just had the same subjective belief. So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much of a practical influence it has on it. Although at the same time, I do feel like if I suddenly stopped believing that anything was wrong, that would probably have an effect on my behavior. Like,
yeah, I'm the same. I just take what is wrong and right to be based on ultimately on preferences, not on a non-natural, whatever the term was that you used, fact of the world. But I did want to say something about moral. So I think there is a branch of, it's kind of debated whether it's actually a branch of anti-realism or not, and I think it's called moral relativism, and that's very culture focused.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's all these different branches of anti-realism, and this one is kind of contested whether it is or not. And it focuses a lot on culture, and that is given a lot as an excuse for a lot of things that are unjust, whether it's like oppression of women or animals. People often use culture. So I think that's one branch of anti-realism that you could say, if it is actually a part of anti-realism, that's been damaging, and like especially to our institutions. And Sam Harris talks about this a lot as well. But I think, like, I've thought about it a lot, and I don't think my version or understanding of moral anti-realism is necessarily going to be damaging in the same way, because it's about individual preferences, and that includes individual preferences of animals, whereas the moral relativist stuff is very much culture focused and focused on humans. So I think some branches of anti-realism, like the ones I follow, actually have potential to be helpful to animals, because it's all about individual preferences. And I think the individual preferences of animals also matter. So I just wanted to put that out there as like, not every branch of anti-realism has been equally bad for like our institutions.
Yeah, this is kind of like, this is like kind of a one argument that sometimes people levy against realism is they say, well, you shouldn't be a moral realist because then that would mean that you're intolerant of some cultures or some behaviors.
Good.
And yeah, like you should be intolerant of some behaviors. Like the way women are oppressed in the Middle East is bad. Like you shouldn't be tolerant of that. But interestingly, like moral realism can explain why tolerance might be a good thing. Like they're appealing to a moral fact. They're saying, look, tolerance is good, so you shouldn't be a moral realist because you should be tolerant. But like that's kind of a realist thing to say. If I was a subjectivist, I said, oh, I just don't care about tolerance, then I wouldn't be making any kind of error. So like people argue for subjectivism in the pursuit of tolerance, but in doing so, they allow people to just reject tolerance because they personally don't care about it. So I think if you want the world to be tolerant, and I think maybe you should be tolerant in some scenarios and intolerant in other scenarios, then it makes more sense to look at that view under a realist view rather than a subjectivist view. Because hey, if my culture doesn't value tolerance, I've not made a mistake.
I gotta say, just from hearing you talk, I think it is true that we tend to speak more in a moral realist language. And I think that might be why people get confused, because we just say, oh, this is wrong, or oh, that's disgusting, or, you know, so it's kind of just a given. And then it drills into us this idea that there are objective, like no one really says, it is my preference that rape is wrong. Like I would never ever say that outside the context of these type of discussions.
Right.
I think language plays a part in our conditioning.
Yeah, this is why these debates, like with, you know, these moral objectivist carnists and stuff, the carnists can kind of sounds really annoying and frustrating to us when they say this kind of shit like, oh, so it's just based on your preference or whatever, because they didn't say any of this stuff about like 9/11. Like, as you say, the world talks in very realist language. When 9/11 happened, not one idiot sat there looking at the TV in the West, at least, and go, why ought we believe the hijackers were wrong? How do you ground your claims that the hijackers were wrong? It was just this given between atheists, Christians, whoever, that it was just wrong. There was no moral questioning or philosophy about it. So that's why it really kind of sounds just stupidly hilarious to me, I guess, when carnists say this kind of stuff in debates, like about the animal holocaust. Where do you ground your morals? And it's just frustrating because they don't ask this for any of the stuff that happens to humans, like 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, I think people are realist if you agree with them and subjectivist if you disagree with them. That's
right.
been my experience.
And that's another point I wanted to make, actually, because that reminds me, actually, Connor. Pat, do you think there's a problem with the way that subjectivists say, oh, it's not in accordance with my preferences? They make it about themselves. Do you not think a better way of saying it would be it's the victim's preferences? Is that not how we should talk about morality?
So that's kind of what I was saying before about how I think some branches of anti-realism might be more helpful to animals than others, because my branch of anti-realism, I guess, moral anti-realism, is based on individual preferences. And I was saying how we should frame it where possible has also the individual preferences of animals, because they're also sentient individuals with preferences. So I wouldn't object to like tailoring that advocacy to focus back on animals. But I think we also need to be aware of this appeal to consequences fallacy, which is an argument that concludes a hypothesis to be true or false based on whether the premise leads to desirable or undesirable consequences. So I just wanted to draw attention to that fallacy, because I think that can sometimes play into the rationale of realists. Like they want to see specific outcomes. And
yeah, I agree.
agree.
Although, like, yeah, we definitely deviated from actual like debating meta-ethics and talking about just the way people think about meta-ethics. We've definitely gotten a little bit off track. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think.
Yeah, we can go back. Like my main contention is just like.
Well, this isn't in any way a formal kind of debate or discussion. I just want to. I'm just interested to hear about all this stuff, because it's all a bit confusing, number one, and number two, it's still, and maybe Pat will say this is kind of an appeal to consequences, but it just doesn't make sense to me that we could live in a world and morality could be subjective. I don't know. It does lead to totally undesirable outcomes, obviously, but that isn't an argument. I totally acknowledge that.
Well, I mean, I think it does work as an argument for realism if you lead out the entailments of anti-realist views and they strike you as really implausible, then I think that is a reason to reject a view. I mean, that's just one reason to reject any view. So like under subjectivism, I was thinking about an example this morning. Like, let's say someone is a racist and they want to go kill someone from another race. But so they have a preference for killing this person, So because morality is subjective, it's actually right for them to go kill this person. But like on the day of killing him, they cowered out and they go, "That's it. I'm not going to do it because I'm kind of afraid." Under subjectivism, they would have done something very wrong by choosing not to murder someone of a different race. And like I take that to be like a really absurd conclusion of the view. Like,
wait,
that just strikes me as the sort of thing that can't be true.
An anti-realist wouldn't think that's wrong. Wouldn't think that's right that the person did that. An anti-realist doesn't think just because everybody has preferences, they should act on their preferences. Anti-realist just has their own preferences, and a rational anti-realist would disagree with a murderer or a racist. So
it sounds like you're arguing for like moral nihilism rather than subjectivism then, because subjectivism says that actually no, there is normativity, but it's just dependent on our attitudes. So it would be right for him to kill them and wrong for him to abstain. But if you're saying that actually no, we just have preferences and there is no normativity, then you're like an error theorist or a non-cognitivist or something like that.
Well, I think the most accurate is just a moral anti-realist. Like I just think every individual has preferences and we're going to act on our own preferences, and whether that's right or wrong is going to depend on our preferences. So we have meaning. It's not nihilism. It's an individualistic meaning. Every individual has their own meaning. And when I say something is wrong, I just mean it's going to be wrong on my preferences. I'll never agree with a person killing someone because that person is a racist or something. So I'm definitely not that branch of moral subjectivist, if that's what it entails.
Would it not be more helpful if, I'm basically repeating what I said a moment ago, but I just want to use an example. So Isaac, ask yourself, whenever he does all these fantastic debates and stuff on YouTube and uses name the trait against people, and then often like one of these people who wants to bring up the whole subjective thing, and Isaac is a subjectivist, when they say to him, what is it that's making you say that's right, or why do you believe this, that this is wrong, he will just respond with, because it's not in accordance with my preferences. Is it not a better tactic for moral anti-realists who use name the trait or whatever to just completely scrap that phrase from now on and say, because it's not in accordance with the victim's preferences? Would that not just be a much better, because it just sounds so wishy-washy. Like I feel, and this is what I feel, Isaac will do this brilliant debate against someone, and then I feel it almost kind of spoils it a little when he just says it's not in accordance with my preferences. When
I think
he could
the
say
reason
the victims.
they would have hashed out a debate, maybe outlined beforehand, and it would have been between Isaac and the debate opponent. So it's not like he's advocating on behalf of a specific animal or animals. They're having a debate between two people, so he's speaking for himself. And Isaac isn't really an activist. He's a philosopher and a debater, so he doesn't overtly concern himself with being like an advocate or an activist or what's the most tactful way. Like he's just sticking to the debate.
But he does, Pat, because I've heard him say to people who say, then what's the point in name the trait if you just believe it's all just subjective? I've heard him actually say he wants the most people to hear this debate and act against the animal holocaust because of his he essentially wants to have these debates because he wants most people to see that it's a logical contradiction and therefore take on his view.
Yeah, even if that is the case, it would be a completely different debate if he's debating on behalf of animal victims. Like it wouldn't, I don't know if the other person would even enter that debate because it will be like what the animal's preferences are, what the species needs are, like what do they eat? Like it'll be something completely different. It'll be a different entailment.
Because to me, when people sort of talk about, when we talk about morals being objective or subjective, and subjectivists just say, oh, it's my beliefs, it's my preferences. It kind of sounds like the carnist personal choice, though, thing. It just doesn't. I think morality is about the victim's preferences. I have a preference to eat steak. I like steak. I don't eat steak because of the victim's preference.
But you have a second order preference. You have a first order preference to eat steak, and you have a second order preference for a better value. So you still have a preference.
Yeah, but as you say, I do have a preference, but it's outweighed by the preference. How can I put this? It's outweighed by the victim's preference.
Yeah, that's something people can do in the advocacy, but I'm not sure it's something you can ask a debater to do because they're debating on specific arguments, and I think that would have a completely different entailment, and he would have to know like the specific needs of an animal, why the animal has that preference, etc. But it's something like you could do. Like my thesis I'm writing is all about animal preferences, so I'm like, I don't think it's a terrible idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just think, I don't think vegans should fall into the whole personal choice though thing, which is ultimately what they end up kind of doing when they kind of talk about, oh, it's just my preferences that I believe this. I totally think, Connor, would you agree that morality is about the victim's preference and not about our preferences?
It's kind of about both.
I mean, I think morality is about pursuing actions that are worth doing, and it happens to be the case that satisfying preferences is the sort of thing that's worth doing, and frustrating preferences is the sort of thing that's not worth doing. Like, I guess if someone hurts an animal because they have a preference for meat, I suppose that does count slightly in favor of eating animals. It's just that the harm so massively outweighs the preference for steak that
are we all vegan here, by the way? Like we're all
vegan,
vegan,
right?
No, Connor's the biggest con.
Like,
oh yeah, I just started eating a Big Mac whilst
yeah.
Just like Connor said this. It's like
yeah, of course I have. Yeah, so like, I mean, I'm not willing to commit myself to saying that like that's my theory of value is like desire satisfaction. But like it probably is good to satisfy preferences. But no, I mean, I think morality is about like what things are valuable and what things are disvaluable.
Now we're coming to kind of near the end of the discussion because I only want it to last about an hour and a half or so. But I guess what I'd like to ask is, because this wasn't any kind of debate, this is just a discussion to try and find the truth value of something. Has anyone here had their, and it doesn't matter, by the way, if the answer is no. I don't care if the answer is no. That's absolutely fine. Has anyone here actually had their opinion swayed in any kind of slightly other direction by what we've discussed so far? Or are we still pretty grounded in what we believed going into this discussion about whether morals are objective or subjective?
Sorry, I'm dropping out a bit. I think I'm lagging out a bit. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you. Your video has stopped though. Oh no, it's back now.
Let me try connecting to a different Wi-Fi. Sorry guys, 1 sec.
That's all right.
Right, is that hopefully better?
Yep.
Connected to a modem that was slightly closer. But
it's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Your video isn't as good, but we can hear you fine.
Not working. Okay. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if I was talking over you or anything like that, Pat. Sorry, George was talking in it, but yeah, I mean, I haven't really been moved much. The objections that Pat has about like being skeptical of non-natural normativity is not the problem I have, and I'm quite happy to use appearances as a source of justification. So, like, yeah, I mean, I'm in the same place. But to be honest, I wasn't really expecting for either of us to be moved. We probably both read enough about this that we've settled probably on where we're going to sit.
What about you, Pat?
Yeah, I mean, I think moral realist claims are on par intellectually with religious claims. I don't see much difference between the two. Neither can be proven. I don't see any reason to believe them. I haven't heard any.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Here's a good question to ask one of you. I will choose. All right, I'll choose Pat to ask this question too. Pat, what would Connor need to convince you of in order for you to believe that morals are objective?
So to justify belief, there needs to be some kind of evidence, anything, of a mind-independent source that prescribes moral value. Outside of the brain, obviously, mind independent.
Connor, are you able to do that, or do you just reject Pat's idea that that's what objective morality is?
No, I mean, I think that's I think where we disagree is whether or not appearances count as mind independent sources by evidence. Because I think that if you're going to say that appearances or seemings or something striking you as true is all just like mind independent subjective beliefs, then that seems to commit us to a lot of saying that a lot of things are subjective that aren't. Like, there are no true contradictions, the rules of logic are subjective, epistemic norms, like you should believe evidence, that's subjective.
Well, yeah, I think most things happen in your head, so I don't see how that's a contradiction. Like, even the way we understand the world is different from the way a bat understands the world, so it's all very subjective. Like, there's mathematical anti-realists, there's scientific anti-realists.
Yeah, so I mean, like, if you're going to be an anti-realist across the board, like, you can maneuver out of that by just going like, yeah, and all that's subjective too. But I just think that that's like a really implausible belief to hold, and I don't think that
objective in the sense that, like,
I was going to say, I don't think the fact that you are a mind that forms beliefs, so in some sense all your beliefs are mind dependent, means that all your beliefs are subjective. I think we are minds that are sometimes able to understand objective truths, and morality is one of those things, despite the fact that we have to understand it through our minds and rational reflection. But there are loads of things that do that.
Seems like a contradiction, but yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Spell out the contradiction, Pat.
Well, he's saying that we can understand moral truths, objective moral truths through our minds, but he's not an anti-realist. So it's like, I don't get it. I honestly don't get it.
Well, I don't think that understanding something through your mind makes you an anti-realist. Like, I understand everything through my mind.
And you need to show
you
need to show a source of moral value. Then that's something that is outside your head, but you can't.
Right.
Okay.
But then you commit saying there's no non-natural facts, but I take that to be like a big bullet to bite. Like, how do I show you that modus ponens is a valid form of inference? Like, I can't point to anything. It just is.
Exactly, because you don't have, there's nothing.
So you don't think it's a valid form of inference? Like,
not in the way that leads to moral realism being true. Like, it could just be a possibility. Like, to say that therefore moral realism is true is just like a very big leap.
I'm not saying modus ponens is a valid form of inference, therefore moral realism is true. I'm saying modus ponens is a non-natural fact that we understand to be true through our minds, yet is objective. So the fact that we understand a non-natural fact to be true through our minds doesn't then mean it's subjective. I'm like, it's a response to a rebuttal that you have, not a therefore moral realism is true.
I'd just like to interject quickly, because we're using quite philosophical, high-level philosophical language that's way above my normie brain right now, and probably a lot of my audience. Could one of you just explain what is meant by the whole phrase? What is it? It's not a valid inference. Was the thing?
So I was saying modus ponens.
Modus ponens, yeah. Can you describe what that whole phrase means, including what modus ponens is and what is meant by valid inference?
So, like, you'll probably recognize the structure of arguments. It'll be like, if X, then Y. Premise 2, X, therefore Y.
Yeah.
And that's valid because if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true.
Right.
So when I say it's a valid form of inference, I'm saying that, like, yes, if you argue in that way, if you say if X then Y, then X then Y, then you're being rational and you're using logic correctly.
Okay, is that what modus ponens is?
Yeah, that modus ponens is a reference. That's the name of the structure.
Okay, okay.
It's like if P then Q. Like if P exists then Q.
Right. Okay, cool.
But like, I don't know that that's a valid form of inference. I don't know that's a valid way of structuring arguments because, like, I did an experiment. I know that's true because I'm a rational agent and it just seems obvious. But then, if that's not going to be a valid form of, if that's going to be a valid source of justification for Pat for morality, then it seems like it's not a valid source of justification for thinking that modus ponens is a valid form of inference. But I really don't want to get rid of that belief because that seems to me to be like really obviously true. It seems like a big bullet to bite to say that actually no, it's subjective whether or not modus ponens is valid.
But it's not a normative belief, and that's the difference. It's like a mathematical logic is a mathematical tool, so there's less to prove, and it does exist in your head to an extent. Like, all knowledge kind of exists within our brain. So I would have no problem saying I'm probably an anti-realist across different fields. But I don't know enough about scientific anti-realism or something like that.
I think
I probably would bite the bullet, to be honest. I don't know enough though about those other fields.
I might be getting the wrong end of the stick here, but I'd just like to ask a quick question to Pat because of her stuff about realism and different minds and how a bat perceives the world differently from a human or whatever it is. Pat, before there was ever a single mind on this planet, what are you saying did exist and what are you saying was objectively true before a mind ever even existed on this planet? Let's go back like billions of years in this universe.
There's not even a singularity, like to the Big Bang.
Yeah. What existed?
I don't know. I'm not really a scientist. The singularity and then the Big Bang, like
did gas exist, for example?
Maybe. I don't know.
I actually don't know. I think it might be plasma, but like I don't know. But like
it was like a gravitational field. I think they call it. There was a gravitational field before anything.
And because there was no one there to even call it a gravitational field or perceive it as gravity, unless you believe in God, why was it a gravitational field, or why was it gravity, or why was it this? Because there's not a single mind on Earth to like perceive this.
I don't know that it was. I don't know that much about this. I don't make claims to things I don't know about. So I think like I've read about it, ages ago. It's probably true, but that would be my standard of belief for that. My standard of belief for gravity would be higher because I know a little bit more about gravity from year 7.
Maybe a more simple way I can phrase it is, let's say all sentient life disappeared off the Earth like tomorrow, but trees still existed. There'd be no one there to call it a tree. So what would make it a tree?
I don't know.
Fair enough.
I think I don't know if it would be a tree because I'm not alive. That's what I mean. Like everything we understand through our brains. David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, has a good book on it. It's called The Brain. And he's got a CBS series about how we understand the world. That's what I was saying, completely different from a bat or a it's like the famous essay by Thomas Nagel. It's called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And we'll never know this subjective experience of qualia, they call it, which is kind of like sentience, but also this feeling of being a subjective person or subjective animal. So without that, I don't have any knowledge outside my head. So it's just raw data, but our brains make color and sounds and everything. But actually the world is silent, it's black and white, it's gooey, and it's just shit everywhere. I don't know. Like we have no idea what things are like outside our brain. And that's kind of extended to, I guess, how I understand morality.
Okay, cool. All right, guys. Well, let's end it there and we can make some little closing statements or whatever. I also just want to say thank you so much to both of you for coming on. It has been really interesting. I've been thoroughly outclassed philosophically and intellectually by you both. I think you were both the two right choice of guests to have on, even though I didn't understand some of what you were saying at certain points, but that's absolutely fine. There's more stuff for me to look into. Yeah, Connor, if you just wanted to make like a brief closing statement, I'll go over to Pat.
Yeah, I don't really know what to say except for stuff that we've already covered. I suppose maybe like it's probably too tall an order to expect that either of us are going to convince people who think the opposite thing to us. But maybe like one thing to pull away is that the fact that people disagree about morality doesn't imply that it's subjective. People disagree about a lot of things. So like maybe that's one good reason I think that's a reason that a lot of people are subject to this. They just go, well, we can't seem to agree, so no, there must be no fact in that. And if I can just root that bad idea out, then I guess that's productive. So yeah. And also I have a blog called Mind Meandering on Substack. It's free. I talk about philosophy and animal rights and other stuff. So go subscribe.
Oh, great. You're both Substack writers then. That's awesome. I'll put the links to that in my description. Pat, on to you.
I guess I would just make the similar point that disagreement doesn't imply that there's moral realism either. The parallel argument to what Connor was saying. And I think while it doesn't show, and it was never my main or central argument, that there is that while it doesn't show, while it doesn't falsify moral anti-realism, I think that there is a stronger case that it shows moral anti-realism than it does moral realism, even though it's not. But that was never my main thing. And we didn't even get to talk about the is-ought gap, but we sort of touched on that a little bit from...
Yeah, I mean, I'm a non-naturalist, so like I don't derive... That's like an argument against moral naturalism, so I would have just sidestepped that. I would just be like, well, I don't derive from is anyway. It would have been a bit of a dead end, I think.
Oh, fair enough. Okay. But just for George's audience, if they're...
Yeah, guys, in my audience, feel free to check out the is-ought gap, David Hume. I don't think anyone has ever provided a satisfying answer to that, though, throughout history. So that might, there might be nothing we can do with regards to that. But yeah, it's David Hume is-ought gap. If you want to look it up on Wikipedia or whatever, it's just like, how do we ground, how do we have the right to say, well, we ought do this just because this happened?
Yeah, that's why I'm a non-naturalist, by the way. Like, I think that argument works against naturalism.
Which is what you're kind of trying to do with the empathy thing. Like, because a brain is a certain way, you're trying to draw from that. Like, it's like you're trying to bridge the is-ought gap with the amygdala, whatever it is, the brain.
Yeah.
That would kind of be an example of someone trying to bridge the is-ought gap.
Sure. I get you. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much both for joining the stream today, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And yeah, go check out that stuff. I'll also put Pat and Connor's Substack links in the description, because Pat writes some very interesting stuff. Connor, I haven't checked out your stuff yet, so thanks for telling us about that on Substack. And yeah, catch us all next time, folks. And yeah, see you later.
Okay, nice to meet you.
Thanks very much, guys. Bye.
Bye.